So I love revenge dramas and I love gore in revenge dramas. But until marry my husband, I didn't realize how much I enjoyed watching my protagonists struggle to retain some humanity, some goodness inside the darkness that they're wading through. In a lot of these dramas about personal revenge, the protagonist may be presented as the mastermind plotting the downfall of their enemies, but their hands remain oddly clean of any actual blood. Think of The Glory. Moon Dong-hyun's real success is in breaking down the toxic friendships amongst her bullies and exposing their truth to the world. But she isn't the one who murders this terrible human being or that terrible human being or this other terrible human being. However, all of that does feel justified, doesn't it? Like karma for genuine trash people. So Dong-hyun gets to have her revenge, her bullies meet terrible ends and can never harm her again, but she can't be held morally or legally responsible for any of the extreme things that happen to them. Side note, Dong-hyun did plot 2 murders where she was directly involved, but notably, they were not for her own revenge. Put a pin on that thought right now, we'll come back to them. Another example is Perfect Marriage Revenge. In their second life, Yeju and her husband So-dok just have to expose the villainous nature of their enemies in front of everybody else and make sure none of their evil plots actually succeed. But the final punishment for the villains kind of takes care of itself. The evil stepmother is locked up, the evil stepsister is trapped in poverty and forced to stay with a man she looks down on, and even So-dok's insecure older brother is easily dispatched after he openly tries to kill So-dok and gets put away for it. Iju and Do-guk's hands are clean. Karma again seems to be doing most of the heavy lifting. One more example. In the Graceful Family, which is an underrated gem, the outcast daughter of a conglomerate family returns to Korea to investigate the murder of her mother 15 years ago. The most likely culprit is a member of her own family. Here again we have a revenge plot where the female protagonist of the drama teams up with a helpful young man to expose the secrets of her corrupt family. Soki causes a lot of upheaval in the lives of her evil relatives and gets extra points for amazing flair. But ultimately, she's not responsible for the terrible fate of the murderer. Her goal was to only reveal the truth and exonerate the innocent. Now, I think the reason writers do this is to keep the soul and conscience of their protagonists clean. Ultimately, what sets apart your good guys from the bad guys? It can't just be revenge for a bad thing. The method matters. And plotting gruesome murder requires a certain amount of cold detachment that isn't usually the hallmark of a hero. Traditionally, when heroes do commit gruesome murders, it's because they have been driven to that point by something particularly heinous that the villains just did. In the grip of passionate rage or raw grief, they end up losing control and acting in a way they usually wouldn't. In every other situation, they would try to prevent the worst outcomes and have all villains punished by law. Again, think of The Glory and how Moon Dong-hyun's ultimate goal was always to force the legal system to punish the people who should be punished, no matter how rich or influential they were.
이 판을 짠 게 당신이죠. 제보도 당신이 했고.
그동안 제 얘기 들어주셔서 감사했어요.
들어야죠. 18년이나 늦었지만.
And then you have the protagonist whose hands are already bloodied, like in Vincenzo, with his long career in the Italian mafia. But note that despite this, he does first try to get justice through the legal system before, of course, he loses it and goes full John Wick. Also in My Name, where everybody involved is pretty much operating outside the purview of the law, and you still have a protagonist who's willing to let go of her final revenge because she has somebody she cares about and he convinces her not to throw her life away. Now, what set the revenge in Marry My Husband apart is the zero-sum nature of its time travel rule. If an event from Ji-won's first life is changed, it will still happen. It may not happen to the same person, but it will still happen.
일어날 일은 어떻게든 일어나.
This made it much harder for the protagonist Ji-won to take a relaxed approach to her revenge. It wasn't enough to change herself and make better choices in her second life. It wasn't enough to just cut out the evil people in her life. She needed to actively change her fate by redirecting her old fate towards someone else. Immediately, this sets up a moral dilemma. Imagine you're being shot at in slow motion. If you move away, the bullet misses you, but then it hits the person behind you. No one will blame you for moving away. The instinct to protect yourself is accepted as natural in every law of every country in the world. No one will blame you for the person getting hit behind you either. You're not the person shooting. You're just protecting yourself. However, let's say you like the person behind you, or you just don't want an innocent person to die. You also don't want to keep standing in the same spot and die yourself. So what you decide to do is grab somebody you hate and hold them in front of both of you. Now, this is something you can absolutely be charged for, criminally and morally. Because while the law acknowledges that you have the right to save yourself or martyr yourself to save somebody else, you don't have the right to force somebody else to die in your place. Especially in the kind of situation where you're holding them down in that spot and violating their right to save themselves. So legally, you don't have much leeway. And morally, well, human morality is a bit weird. You may have some wiggle room if the person you're trying to scapegoat is really the worst. Like, the worst. Now, back to Marry My Husband. Ji-won knows that her fate in her first timeline was to face a decade of abuse from her husband and in-laws, be professionally sabotaged by her BFF, be cheated on by her husband and her BFF, get cancer from stress and neglect, and get accidentally killed by her husband who just got caught committing adultery and insurance fraud. Admittedly, some pretty bad stuff. But if you care to compare the crimes of Min-hwan and Sumin in 2023, would you perhaps agree with me that Min-hwan deserves the larger portion of Ji-won's rage and revenge? Yet, once back in 2013, who does Ji-won hand her awful fate over to? Who does she grab a hold of and hold in front of her like a shield? It's Sumin.
수민아, 나 쓰레기 버릴 게 있는데 좀 버려줄래?
If everything were to happen according to Ji-won's plan, Sumin is the one who gets to inherit the bad husband, the awful in-laws, the lackluster career, the fatal illness, and the murder at the hand of Min-hwan. Meanwhile, Min-hwan presumably gets to live out the exact same life that he had lived out before. See, regardless of Min-hwan's crimes against Ji-won in her past life, she doesn't really have any plans to punish him. Her only objective at this point is to save herself from repeating the same fate. So as far as Ji-won is concerned, none of this is really about vengeance against her husband, while her plan to shift her fate to Sumin happily coincides with Sumin getting punished. But it's really an accident. Ji-won didn't think of this plan trying to punish Sumin. Sumin is just a casualty. See, from my perspective, at this point in the story, nothing Sumin of 2013 has done deserves this kind of punishment. Ji-won should be cutting her out of her life because she's a toxic friend, but a murder sentence? You can try to spin this as Ji-won saying to Sumin that you coveted what was mine, so go ahead and take it. Enjoy.
네가 탐내던 내 쓰레기 네가 처리해.
However, this is not a vague matter of Ji-won handing over her shitty boyfriend to her jealous bestie and washing her hands off both of them. Ji-won knows exactly what happens in that life. She knows she's handing over a depressing death sentence and she's willing to actively make sure it happens.
박민아는 지금까지 오면서 몇 번이나 멈출 수 있었지만 멈추지 않았어요. 아마 끝까지 갈 거예요.
그렇다면 문제 없겠네요. 정수민도 끝까지 갈 것 같거든요.
Of course, things don't play out the way Ji-won had planned, and fate doesn't accept her handy substitution. It finds someone else who had a similar personality to the one Ji-won had in her first life. So the cheating husband and the fatal illness goes over to Ji-won's colleague Juran, someone she likes. Now it's no longer enough for Ji-won to step away and let the bullet hit the person behind her, which she thought would be Sumin but turns out to be Juran. She will have to drag Sumin in front of her and pin her in place so that both Ji-won and Juran are protected. At this point in the drama, is Sumin bad enough to deserve this kind of a punishment? No, but hold on a minute. The writers think this is a great time to introduce a new villain who will conveniently come up with a murder plot against Ji-won and involve both Min-hwan and Sumin. So, now that Sumin has tried to kill Ji-won, she is clearly irredeemable. And it's okay for our protagonists to maneuver her to her death. Can you now maybe see how this has become less about getting justice or revenge for past wrongs and more about the show finding any reason, any means necessary to justify the ending? See, Ji-won was always planning to have Sumin die either from cancer or at Min-hwan's hands. The moment she said, "Marry my husband" at the end of episode 2, this was always the plan.
내 남편과 결혼해줘.
Sumin would take on Ji-won's fate. All of it. The webtoon is a lot less coy about this. Ji-won knows what she's doing is cold-blooded. She even tries to keep Ji-hyuk out of the final leg of her plan because she doesn't want his soul to be muddied. Which, by the way, would have been an excellent reason to temporarily break up with Ji-hyuk in the drama instead of the stupid reason they used. But then drama Ji-won never really acknowledges the perversity of what she's doing.
축하해. 내가 버린 쓰레기. 알뜰살뜰 좋은 거.
Ji-won's glee at this moment when Min-hwan and Sumin are finally getting married reveals the crux of my discomfort with the show. Ji-won thinks she's succeeded in shifting her fate onto Sumin, which means she wholeheartedly believes that Sumin is facing domestic violence, cancer, and death at Min-hwan's hands from this point on. But the show wants us to remember that this moment is Ji-won's triumph against two incorrigibly evil people. It doesn't really want us to think of how Ji-won is trapped in a time slip with rules that she's figuring out by herself and has no alternative. Because see, I'm willing to admit that Ji-won has no choice. To save herself, she has to shift her fate to someone else. She didn't make that rule, it's just the situation that she finds herself in. But that also means that Ji-won would be stuck with the same choice even if Sumin turned out nicer in this life. Either she repeats her fate or chooses someone else to take the fall. And it's just so much easier for our hero when the patsy deserves no sympathy and Ji-won doesn't have to struggle with her conscience.
나쁜 놈들이 적당히 못되고 말면 복수하기도 애매하잖아. 근데 이놈들은 포기하지 않고 끈질기게 못돼 쳐먹어줘서 고마워. 너무 고마워.
However, the absolute lack of any moral hesitation, any real remorse for what she's doing, any recognition of how messed up the situation that she's trapped in actually is, makes her seem like she is convinced that she's the hero of the story. Because at this point, it's not even about punishment. She's not handing out proportional justice. She's ready to force this fate on Min-hwan and Sumin whether they turn into murderers or not. This makes Ji-won closer to a villain than the hapless, malevolent couple she's trying to punish. It also doesn't help that Ji-hyuk, her partner in crime, often talks like a real villain.
무대가 갖춰주고 있어요. 물론 보험은 박민환이 나쁜 마음을 먹지 않는다면 쓸모없겠지만
내가 죽으면 우리 엄마 아빠는 내 사망보험금
When he uses his money and power to buy up all of Minhwan's debts and then puts pressure on him first to marry Sumin and later to such desperation that he's considering killing himself, Ji-hyuk is the oppressor there.
지원 씨는 착해서 모르겠지만 어떤 인간들은 적당이란 걸 몰라요. 내 마음이 불편할 정도로 완벽하게 밟지 않으면 끝나지 않아요.
This isn't smart strategic revenge. This isn't using Minhwan and Sumin's own weaknesses, their own choices against them. This is using brute force to strip away all of their choices and only leaving one path open. This is Villainess. In every revenge drama, there comes a point when the hero has to consider the cost to their soul. In My Name, Yoon Ji-woo nearly gave up her final revenge for the sake of the man she fell in love with until he was brutally murdered and she stopped caring about consequences and her own fate. In Vincenzo, the hero's hands are not clean. He's directly responsible for a lot of deaths. Yet we don't find him morally reprehensible. Not just because the villains were all psychopaths. I think it's because of Hong Cha-young, the woman he loves.
변호사님, 장한석 쪽 마무리하는 거 이번에 정말 변호사님 빠져도 돼요. 지금까지는 악당이었지만 이 일이 끝나고 나면 정말 악마가 되는 거예요.
Her hesitation with his methods allowed us a few scenes where the show could persuade us, as she was grimly persuaded, that there really was no other way.
지금까지 우리가 해온 일 솔직히 견디기 힘들 정도로 잔혹했어요. 근데 왜 내가 변호사님 뜻을 따랐는지 알아요? 장한석 같은 인간을 징벌할 최선의 법은 존재하지 않아요. 차선의 법도 없고요. 그래서 변호사님의 차악을 따른 거예요. 그게 옳다고 생각됐으니까요.
Even so, ultimately, Vincenzo wasn't given a conventional happily ever after. He has to spend the rest of his life in exile and figure out the worst kind of long-distance relationship with Hong Cha-young.
그럼 수교 기념일에만 올 수 있는 거예요?
네, 단 하루만요.
Now remember the two murders Moon Da-young was directly responsible for in The Glory? Both of them were on behalf of other people. The first was Kang Hyun-nam's husband. The deal that Dong-hyun had with this desperate woman was that she would help free her from her abusive husband and ensure a bright future for her daughter. Killing the man ended up being the only way this could really happen. But while Dong-hyun had spent decades channeling her grief into rage and allowing coldness to seep into her soul, Imo didn't have that emotional armor. Even as she was following Dong-hyun's plan, knowing that the breadcrumbs she was laying out would lead to her husband's death, she was constantly conflicted. We are shown how she is rethinking her actions until the very last moment. Ultimately, her desperate wish to save her daughter is what pushes her to go through with it. But you never get the sense that she thinks what she's doing is the right thing, that she can be untouched by it. Her conscience is so badly affected that she sends her daughter away to another country thinking she has no right to see her ever again. That is a protagonist. The second murder is at the very end and we don't really get to see how it pans out. We do, however, see all of the emotional turmoil Joo Yo-jung goes through for years, trying to forget the callous laughing face of the man who murdered his father. He's tried to move on, he's tried to forget, but it's like a thorn in his heart that he can't get rid of. Not the least because the murderer keeps sending him goading letters. So the final murder is one Dong-hyun decided to plot for Yo-jung's sake, to end his misery. And again, the story tells us that the decision wasn't taken lightly, that there is a cost to a revenge like this.
오늘 이건요.
With Marry My Husband, the really interesting thing is the writers do include a couple of scenes where Ji-won feels bad for what she's doing to Sumin. But those moments quickly pass with Ji-won getting exactly the reassurance she needs that she's a good person and that Sumin is evil no matter what.
덜 못돼서 그래. 상대에게 일부러 상처 줄 정도로 못되지 못해서 그래. 지원 씨는 할 일을 한 거야.
It's also notable that those scenes happen while Ji-won still thinks that passively pushing Sumin and Min-hwan together is enough to subvert her fate. Once Ji-won decides that she needs to actively ensure that Sumin and Min-hwan go down that tragic path to Sumin's death, her conscience never speaks up again. If we are to consider that what Ji-won is facing right now is an injustice of fate, she's being forced to turn into a murderer to save herself and her friend. In such a situation, the least we can expect from a protagonist is some amount of soul searching in the face of such cruel action. But we get none of that. In the end, what saved Marry My Husband for me was fate refusing to go along with Ji-won's plans again, and Min-hwan ending up dead instead of Sumin. Because I don't love protagonists who play God and don't even feel a twinge in their conscience about it. If breaking another human being and pushing them into desperate actions doesn't scar you, even if they were awful people, and especially if you were trapped by fate, then were you ever the good guy to begin with?